Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to come. I have to admit, talking to insurance people, that's a little bit different for me. I'm used to speaking with clinicians, doctors, risk managers. So, people in the insurance industry, this is pretty cool. And I do understand you guys are people too, right? All right, so I'm going to go a little off the beaten track right now. But this is near and dear to my heart because this is my life experience, facing challenges of access to language for appropriate health care. So that's what we'll be talking about today. First, I want to kind of set the stage for what it feels like.
Doctor on Tio. Tandoro.
Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry.
Attendi vianton.
Look, she's been crying nonstop. She has a temperature of 105. I don't know what to do.
Marabidig. Vi paroles
No,
lasant.
please, just every time I feed her, she throws up. I don't know.
Vi paroles
I don't understand what you're
lasant.
saying. What are you saying? Can you just look at her? No, she's burning up. Just feel.
Faju paroles la anglan.
No, what?
Povos ma Brandon meslogena.
She's burning up. Feel her head.
Tranquilli kananche. The Monday is askan.
What is he doing?
Do you have?
My baby, she's got a temperature of 105. Every time I feed her, she throws up. Please, just, can you?
Teneskila vor temporasco.
She's burning up. Feel her head.
Morapidig.
Please, just feel her
Emna
head.
povos comprenia.
Feel her head. Just someone let me in to see the doctor. No, does anyone understand what I'm saying? Please, someone help me.
8% of U.S. citizens speak limited English. For these 25 million Americans, professional interpreters can mean the difference between life and death.
So I want you to imagine for yourself, actually out of curiosity, how many of you in here are parents? How many have children? So now I want you to imagine bringing your sick child in. You go to a place that, you're in the same country, you should know the language, but you don't, and you're trying to understand what's going on. Or even worse, you're admitted to the emergency room and you don't know what's happening to you. So that's a daily experience of deaf people throughout the country. Lawsuits are filed, and often there are huge settlements to the claimants because
it's a human rights issue.
It's a human rights issue. So these are a few to mention. Florida, Colorado, Tennessee, fairly recently actually. Not providing language access is a huge issue, not only with deaf individuals, but with non-English speaking individuals as well. So we look at Hennepin County, that's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They have 148 full-time interpreters on staff. 120,000 requests are made each year. And there are big language access issues in Minnesota. Only 5% of those requests are related to ASL interpreter requests. However, 100% of the lawsuits against the hospital, Hennepin County, are related to language access from deaf people. And this means for some reason, society, hospitals, doctors are not recognizing the importance of language access for deaf individuals. They think, oh, this person can read lips, it's fine. Honestly, in the best of situations, it's a struggle. If I'm sick, I can guarantee you I'm not going to be able to catch anything. Do any of you know how to downhill ski? Any skiers in here? Okay, great. So you'll relate to this story. So when you ski, I skied and I learned something very early on. Thumbs make lousy skis. So I was pushing myself, probably a little bit too much. I was on a black run that I was not prepared for. And I did a beautiful face plant. Right, and landed on my thumbs. Both of them were bent the opposite direction. I didn't actually know thumbs could go that way. So I was about 11,500 feet, and the first aid shack was down about 8,000 feet. That's a long way when you're in so much pain. The whole way down, I'm thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to figure out how to communicate with people at the first aid shack. So I'm thinking, and the more I thought about it, the worse my thumbs hurt. So I finally get down there, and do you have any idea how hard it is to get your skis off when you don't have really good access to your hands? Or even worse, holding the ski poles? Anyway, I got to the shack, got the skis off. And ski boots, by the way, are wonderful door knockers. They make enough noise, it's very effective. So we got the door open, someone came up to me, Grizzly Adams. Big beard, big mustache. And I just see the mustache moving. So I'm thinking, I need to part this. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, I'm gesturing that I can't hear. So he walks away, comes back with Grizzly Adams Jr. So I'm struggling at this point, and the younger guy's saying, oh yeah, I can sign, I can help. So I'm looking at, going, okay. Have any of you ever traveled to another country? How do you feel when you finally meet someone who speaks English? That is the feeling. My pain was cut in half in that moment. That's how important language access is. So anyway, Hennepin County has had multiple lawsuits. Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, they don't even try to fight any lawsuits. If a deaf individual files a suit related to language access, they will go ahead and settle it because they have lost so many suits. And it's not just hospitals with this. More and more we're noticing it's individual medical practices that are losing these lawsuits. Because where is your first contact? Where do you get information? Where is that first, what's going on with the person, how you treat them? It's typically you go to a general practitioner. That's the first stop. So we see this often. Deaf people are pushing for their rights at general practitioner offices as well. Now, let me just give you a little idea of how pervasive this problem actually is. Not too long ago, we had a meeting with the Alabama Association for the Deaf, and we had the same discussion with the other 49 associations for the deaf, any of the other ones, we can have the same conversation. So we pose the question, how many of you in the past have experienced a time when you or someone you care about has needed medical attention? And in that situation, an interpreter hasn't been provided. Across the board, 100% of them have had that experience. Most of them say that they were the individual who has experienced it more than once. I've experienced it. Once or twice, and after that, it seemed like maybe there was some networking in the medical field because it hasn't happened much to me anymore. Just think about that. I'm going to tell you a story about a young deaf woman. We'll call her Katie, or Kate. She had a mental illness. She lived in a group home. The group home was run by deaf individuals. So communication access was there day in and day out. One day, her illness, she started to deteriorate rather quickly and had to go to the emergency room. This was, late in the evening. And the psych resident on duty looked her over, said, we don't need an interpreter. Let's just go ahead with this. Looked her over and sent her on her way. The next morning, she was out of control. Police needed to be called, and she was placed in jail. How many of you would accept that kind of thing for your own family members? It's commonplace with deaf individuals. Now, as insurance companies, you have an interest in preventing that. The more a person's health deteriorates, the more expensive it becomes, correct? So it becomes more of a common sense thing. If we catch the problem early, it's easier to treat and it's less expensive. But with deaf individuals, they arrive even sicker because in the first place, they think about the struggle with communication and then they don't understand what's being said. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a heavier emphasis placed on making sure that there's language access provided. Executive Order 13166, that applies to language access. It expands on Title VI of the Civil Rights Protection to individuals who do not speak English. And that includes specifically mentioned deaf individuals. The Department of Health and Human Services set out guidelines for that. Maybe in 2005. It was specifically listed the requirements for providing interpreters in medical settings. So if any federal funding is involved at all, you are required to provide that kind of access. And then later, the Joint Commission set out new standards, and those standards were very clear what is required for approving a qualified interpreter. Now, I'm going to jump off track a little bit. Maybe not. Have any of you seen the story about the interpreter in Manatee County, Florida? The emergency announcement? Did you see that? If you saw that, you saw the backlash. Unfortunately, many hospitals and many doctors would be perfectly satisfied with that kind of interpreting. Would you accept that? We have laws, standards, rules, regulations, but people don't often follow them. There's a fight right now with one hospital. Their policy on paper is just fine. However, when a deaf person shows up to the hospital, they will be asked to sign a waiver of rights to language access before even being allowed treatment. I doubt anything like that happens in the rest of the country. Here in Birmingham, not long ago, there was one well-known deaf professional who was scheduled for a heart procedure. His surgeon was the chief of cardiology. The surgeon called to request that there will be an interpreter there. So they went ahead with scheduling. You know, patient shows up at 5 in the morning. And what's up with that? Why do surgeons always insist on having surgery start at 5 in the morning? Why? 4 is when I go to bed. Come on. So, patient arrives at the hospital, 5 a.m., checks in, and says, and gestures that they are deaf. And they get that, you know, deer in the headlights look. You know that expression. That's the look on the receptionist's face. So they write back and forth for a minute. The patient says, yes, I'm deaf. I'm here for my surgery. Where's the interpreter? And this is the look that the patient gets. Again, the deer in the headlights. From 5 until about 11 o'clock, they waited. And finally, they made ad hoc preparations. At 11:30, they actually had an interpreter on site. Isn't there something in the Geneva Convention that says, you know, you can't withhold food from people for, 12 hours? Like, you can't eat anything from 8 p.m. the night before until who knows when. So at this point, I'm not worried about my heart anymore. I'm worried about starving to death. The hospital itself has the best reputation in the state for providing language access. But hello, what happened? The policy is fine. It's the follow-through that's the problem.
So this situation happened in Long Island, New York. And it's very common throughout the country for geriatric care. So, a man, he was sick and dying. And no one informed him why he was dying. I can't imagine how that felt. but I can't imagine it. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not only the deaf population, but other populations as well that struggle with access to language. So, for example, the guy in Manatee County that they pulled in as a quote unquote interpreter because he had good enough language skills to screw everything up. And it happened in a similar case to Willie Ramirez. So this individual was poisoned. And so
Because he was young and Hispanic, they assumed.
Okay, because he was young and Hispanic, they assumed he was suffering from an overdose, a drug overdose. But why, when they had the quote-unquote Spanish interpreter, he interpreted the word intoxicado, Spanish word intoxicado. It doesn't mean intoxicated as in drunk, it's intoxicated as in poisoned. And so before anyone figured out what was going on, the person deteriorated too rapidly that he couldn't be saved. Do you require fluency in the interpreters that you use? In many states, there are state laws that describe the minimum fluency skills for sign language interpreters. And some states also have it for spoken language interpreters as well, such as Washington State, for example. Their regulations are pretty strict related to spoken language interpreters. Ironically, it's not as strong for sign language interpreters. In Massachusetts, they have good regulations related to medical interpreting, but it doesn't matter. In general, it doesn't matter if it's signed or spoken language. But most states don't have regulations like these. The majority of states will just grab someone, oh, you know a little bit of Spanish, here, come on, and use that. Or worse, they'll let the children interpret for the parents. If you've never seen it, it's worth watching. The Life of Silence. Love of Silence, thank you. Love is never silent. Thank you. There's one particularly just heart-wrenching part. So what happened? There were two children that were hearing, and mom and dad were deaf. The girl was the oldest, and the boy was the youngest. The little boy had fallen and was killed. So the parents are deaf, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And so they're going to buy a coffin. The girl was stuck interpreting for her parents in the process of buying a coffin and preparing funeral arrangements for her younger brother. And this girl was 12. So you all have the expression, of what's up with that? But it happens all the time. It's very commonplace. So when I had a heart attack, my daughter was there. This is my own personal story. My daughter was there. My daughter signs a little bit. But I'm not going to ask my daughter to suffer through interpreting for her father while he's preparing for open heart surgery. It's not fair to her. It's not right. Some people think, the stories, like
Willie Ramirez.
like Willie Ramirez, you know, you think that doesn't happen today, even though that suit was settled for $72 million, but it still continues to happen in this day and age. You know, because he was dying and he had absolutely no idea why until half an hour before he passed away. In this next case. Most often, people think you know a little bit of sign language, that means you can interpret. However, that is not the same thing as a skilled interpreter. We discussed this a little bit before we started. So an interpreter, their ability to pay attention and process and translate and express from one language to another deteriorates severely after 18 minutes of processing and working. And that's when you have a team of interpreters who are taking turns. So now imagine you're doing simultaneous interpreting, which is what my interpreters are doing right now. They're trying to catch up with me and keep up. And so their brains are quickly processing what I'm signing and trying to find the English equivalent for it and then produce it at the same time as I'm still producing the next sentence or concept or idea. It is a skill, and I don't know how they do it. I don't have enough functioning brain cells left to be able to do that. Interpreters are trained. It is the responsibility of the provider to make sure to validate that they are having a skilled interpreter. The Joint Commission calls that vetting an interpreter. We face a multitude of attitudes. Some facilities are wonderful and have no problem, but the majority of facilities are stubborn. And, and their attitude is, if you're going to force me to have an interpreter, you're not welcome as a patient at my hospital. On the flip side, when you find a doctor who is willing to provide interpreters, the deaf community will flood their offices and all become patients. So the burden, increases significantly. Now that you have one facility that is willing to provide interpreters, the deaf community flocks to it, and now the burden of responsibility for the provider increases drastically. So while this is happening, keep in mind ASL and English are completely different languages. American Sign Language is spatial. It's a spatial language. It's not linear. So imagine expressing a concept in 3D. You can express it in sign language faster. You're not limited to words. You can express and show the entire concept and idea. During this presentation, I typically, will change my language and sway more towards a professional English dialogue. However, my daily life, I use a much more ASL fluent. Why am I rolling my eyes? Being the nice guy that I am, and he told the interpreter not to roll her eyes. both of the interpreters work for me. You know, they know better. I sign their paychecks. So the nice guy that I am, I will shift my language more towards an English signing style. But in daily conversation, my signing style is quite drastically different. So now I'm sitting going, okay, where am I in my PowerPoint? Here we are. You know, most people look at me and think, oh, poor deaf man and his disability. And I'm not disabled. I just use a different language. So what if you looked at it that way? Looked at me as a language group instead of a disability group. Your approach and perspective would be drastically different. You know, I've traveled, as a deaf person, I've traveled the country and the world, and it's easier for me to socialize and travel in other countries than it is in America. Why do you ask? When I go to another country, they don't expect me to read their lips and understand their language. You know, because we have that stereotype that all deaf people can lip read in the dark. Blindfolded. You know, wouldn't it be nice if we could figure out another way to communicate? You know, and legally, we can do that here in America if we stop focusing on spoken language and focusing on presenting information in different ways and modalities. Okay. So say I have a deaf person here, and I have an unqualified interpreter, or no interpreter at all. So where do you think the problems could arise? Let me count the ways. Would you prefer it alphabetically or time sequentially? So in the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen a variety of approaches to technological difficulties. So at the,
Video conferencing.
such as video conferencing, thank you. Specifically in relations to what we call video remote interpreting, or VRI. And it is a tool, something that can be used, however, so you don't, but keep in mind, you don't use a hammer to nail in a screw.
So just a few suggestions here. Who decides if it's effective communication? It's the consumer. Or excuse me, it's the clinician has decided that it's effective or not. But really, it should be the patient who determines whether or not the communication is effective. So with Executive Order 13166, that led to culturally and linguistically appropriate standards. So we have class. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with this, but I do suggest you look at it. So these are 5, 6, and 7 are directly related to language access. So number 7 here. Thou shalt vet thy interpreters. If not, then it's the patient's responsibility to say that, this interpreter is or is not qualified. It's not up to the interpreter to say, yep, I can do this. In Alabama, we do require interpreters to have a license. And I'll ask Catherine here to pull out hers. Licensed interpreters in Alabama will carry this card. We'll pass that around so you can see what it looks like. Do you want to stay out of court? Ask the interpreter to see their license. It's as easy as that. For spoken language interpreters, it's a little bit more difficult, but you can ask what their training is, what their background is. There have been some background standards regarding spoken language interpreters. If you're interested in that information, just let me know and I can send that off to you. Medical organizations covered by TJC must follow this. So action has led to barrier-free healthcare initiative, and they're trying to find ways to break down the barriers for both language and disability access. If you go to the website, the DOJ website, Department of Justice, and they have information on barrier-free healthcare, there's a plethora of information that they're going through to try and solve these issues of access. So some may think, why bother? It's better for the patients, and it's cheaper for the insurance companies. I mean, really, we can boil it down to dollars and cents. Effective communication reduces stays in hospitals. It reduces recidivism into hospitals. And this means less reliance on emergency rooms instead of primary care. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but many emergency rooms have become like primary care centers for many individuals. If they can't get language access at their doctor's office, they know they can force a hospital to do it. Which, let's be real, that's a little ridiculous. So what do we need to do? First, we need to raise awareness. So it's interesting, this is a different group, and most of the time I don't have access to conversations with people like yourself, so thank you very much for this. And I hope that this can spread awareness too, that this is a big issue. This is a life and death issue. We want to make sure that your covered entities will have clear policies and will follow them. Do you have any training related to class in your organization? The culturally and linguistically appropriate services? That would be a good place to start. Now, depending on where you're from, it's my understanding that you're from all over the country. It would be nice to see states develop policies where any medical organization with a claimant in their pool. Well, here, let me give you an example of how this could work. So in Chicago, this relates to attorneys, but conceptually, we can get the idea of how it would apply here. So there are attorneys in Cook County, in Chicago, and they pay into a pool. So anytime an attorney needs to provide services to a deaf individual, they can they have access to that pool of funds, so the burden isn't on any one individual. So remember that doctor I discussed earlier who would be willing to provide interpreters. That provides a huge burden. However, if many providers would pay into a pool, it lessens the burden on those who are willing to do the right thing. When the ADA was passed, it specifically forbade third-party entities from paying for access. So let me rephrase this. The ADA forbade passing the cost on for access to third-party payers. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it created a huge problem. Instead, it would be better to, create language access and be able to just bill for those services. I know maybe I'm saying some bad things talking to insurance companies or talking to insurance people, but language access is how you provide effective medical services. My thing is psychiatric care. One of the things missing from that care is, deaf people are placed throughout the country instead of in a place where people are skilled at working with them. So, deaf people are looked at as a low incidence population. There's 2 of us for every 1,000 people. But we can be very expensive when our language access needs aren't met. So again, Hennepin County in Minnesota, they have 148 staff interpreters. It's cost effective. The Office of Deaf Services in the Alabama Department of Mental Health, we have staff interpreters. It's more cost effective, and it's better for our consumers as well. So why not encourage large hospitals and organizations to establish their own staff interpreter pool? If they had staff interpreters, even if they had staff interpreters, showing up at 5 a.m. may still be an issue. If you have contract interpreters, maybe they would say, oh, it's too early, I don't want to take that job. And that's what happens. People who contract in may not want to take a job that early. So I mentioned this before, I'm going to mention it again. It's the elephant in the room. Who's paying the bills? Right now, the courts are saying it is the doctor's responsibility, period, end of discussion. That's the reality. As an administrator, I recognize that that is a problem. The problem is it's a burden on practices that have many deaf individuals. Other areas say, oh, not my problem, we don't have to worry about it. But that doesn't seem very equitable, especially when you're struggling to have enough healthcare providers in general. How can we make this more equitable? Often we hear people say, they talk about Medicaid. Here in Alabama, Medicaid does not pay for interpreters. In some states, they do. Medicaid is not, it's not your area. But what happens is Medicaid becomes the representative for, future situations. Now, some states, they will bill for interpreters, for interpreter services. Again, Alabama is not one of them. 8 states do. I had an interesting discussion with a chief medical officer for an insurance company out of Nashville. So this person happens to be a psychiatrist and also happens to be a signer. One of the very few psychiatrists in the country who can sign. Not fluently, but is a signer. We could have a conversation. I would compare it to Spanglish. That kind of thing. So you can get by. You can have a conversation. One of our discussions talked about managed care organizations. So this doctor was testing a concept that would embed language access in the general care as part of their procedures. It was interesting. I want to go back after a while to see how that works out. Do you deal with psychiatric hospitals? Anyone in here? Some? Yes? Okay. That's not the focus of my discussion, obviously, but I do just want to throw this out there. Psychiatry is 100% communication-based. Think about that. I won't beat a dead horse. I just want to throw that out there. About 3 years ago, a decision was made, Belton versus Shelp. It was in Georgia. It states interpreters are not equal access. So that's where legal thinking is going. So just something to keep in mind. For what it's worth, though, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama and South Carolina all have court decisions with similar language as this. So if we want to avoid situations like we did with Kate in the beginning of the presentation, or like me waiting 6 hours before my procedure for an interpreter to show up, we need to think about how we can encourage our providers to prioritize language access. So, thank you for listening so patiently and giving up part of your day Feel free to reach out anytime.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your patience during my presentation. I hope it was helpful.